love, connecting your body with your soul, and the whole range of modern associations to which yoga has been associated. If you look, though, at the uses yoga has been put to in history, the idea of yoking, and the word yoke is an Indo-European root that goes alongside yoga. The idea of yoking your body and mind was used as much as a tool of power as it was of a self-realization or finding your inner self. And throughout Indian history, yogis have been as much feared as loved. And for much of 18th and 19th century history, yogis have been specifically associated with war, mercenary violence, and with large cohorts of armed men wearing very little clothes but having huge numbers of weapons attached to themselves, who were rented out by the different competing powers in North India. William, or Vijay Pinch, has written this extraordinary book, which I would nominate as the most well-written, readable, well-researched academic book published ever by the Cambridge University Press. It's got completely the wrong publisher. It should be in a very kind of lurid paperback with a large sort of with a large naked yogi holding some very sort of phallic knob kerry or something with a bright red background. It is a fabulous read. It gives an incredible picture of life during the anarchy, this extraordinary period, fascinating period, when on one hand, everything had broken down as the end of the Mughal Empire fractured into 100 different polities. Every little town in Rajasthan, every regional grouping was asserting itself, fighting with its neighbors. War was endemic, and yet this is the period when is built almost everything the tourists come to India to see today. All these palaces in Rajasthan, all these fortified towns, so many of them date from the 18th century and the early 19th century, the period we're going to be hearing about today. So I very, very warmly recommend Vijay Pinch to your attention, not just for the next hour, but you need to go straight to the bookshop and buy several copies of his book and write to his publishers complaining that they haven't marketed it properly. Thank you.
Should I stand there? Yeah, well, I think I will stand and make a few comments. So I should probably take this off if I'm going to use that. Is that correct?
I think you keep it on unless there's a loud shriek.
Keep it on unless there's a loud shriek. Well, okay. So thank you, William, for that wonderful introduction. You've already heard basically the argument of the work, so I don't need to say much. I also want to apologize. Well, first I want to say this is my first ever literary festival, so I'm a little nervous, so I hope you'll forgive me. But this is a lot of fun, and I'm delighted to be invited. And I've had a great time so far, and it's only been, what, maybe 15 hours or thereabouts. And I look forward to having a wonderful rest of the week. So I want to thank William, of course, and the organizers. I also want to apologize because I actually have a lot of great images for this talk, but last night around 10 p.m. my computer crashed and I can't seem to access the backup system in Connecticut. So you'll have to do without the images. You'll just have to look at me. And I can maybe demonstrate naked yogi warfare if you like, but I'd prefer not to. Maybe later after a few martinis. So you'll just have to go out and buy the book, I guess. There are images in the book. Not as many as I would have liked to have had in the book because they're so expensive. And as William pointed out, it's an academic book, and I'm a pointy-headed academic. And so, whoa. Can everybody hear me, or is that echoing? Sounds kind of funny here. You cannot hear me? It's not clear. Let me get rid of this.
I'll have to.
Is that better? that better? Okay. So I'd like to do 2 or 3 things in a few minutes, and then we can open it up. William has some questions for me, and I hope you all have some questions. And I'd like to first sort of give a brief sketch of Anupgiri's life and career, and then reflect, secondly, briefly on who he was. And that's a difficult thing to do, in part because he's very much, I consider him very much a kind of subaltern, and subalterns had a hard time, actually, even though he was a commander of many men, and ultimately became a Maharaja of sorts in Bundelkhand, we have a hard time actually gaining access to his voice. But I do want to reflect on who he was as best we can. And then I want to situate him in what I call the longer history of the political imaginary of asceticism in South Asia. And that's really a fancy way of saying the idea of the ascetic in political discourse and the idea of the national redemptive ascetic, particularly in modern India. So, a brief narrative about Anupgiri's career. He was born in the 1730s in Bundelkhand, in the village of Gulpahar, which is in Mahoba district, near Khajuraho. His mother was destitute, his father had died. He was soon acquired, perhaps purchased, by a Gusain. He allegedly, or according to tradition, Anupgiri was a Brahmin, born into a Brahmin family. It's hard to know if that's true, but anyway, that's what tradition articulates. He was acquired by a wandering Gusain who was a commander of an army of wandering Naga Gusains, who were headquartered near Jhansi in Mot, but were on their way to wandering about between points like Prayag and other points in the Gangetic Plain. And he and his brother Umraugiri, who becomes known to us, they become known to us as Anupgiri and Umraugiri. We don't actually know their original names. They're acquired by Rajendragiri, their guru, man who becomes their guru and commander. And they actually grow up in his care, and there are stories about Anupgiri playing with clay soldiers and learning the arts of war, and his guru seeing him play with the toy soldiers and actually realizing that he's a great strategist, and so he eventually trains him up into the commanding officership of the Gusain force. In the early 1750s, this army actually is in Allahabad, in Prayag, at either the Magh Mela or the Kumbh Mela, and this is when Allahabad is controlled by the Safdarjung, the Nawab of Awadh, as part of the state of Awadh, or the successor state of Awadh. And they actually assist Safdarjung's forces in the defense of Allahabad, the fort, from the Bangash Afghan Nawabs of Farrukhabad, and actually do a very good job. They actually are instrumental in allowing the Nawab of Awadh, Safdarjung, to actually retain Allahabad. And so as a result, they enter the service of the Nawabs of Awadh from 1751 until 1775. So for those 24-odd years, they're in the service of Awadh. As William mentioned, they are a kind of mercenary force. They sell their services to the highest bidder. That was very typical of the military labor market, the military topography of this period. And they rise up. Actually, Rajendragiri, the guru, dies in 1753 on the walls of Delhi, in what is now Talkatora Gardens. If you walk around Talkatora Gardens with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, it's apparently a lover's spot now. This is where a major battle was fought, a kind of civil war for the control of the Mughal emperor in the mid-18th century. And Umraugiri and Anupgiri actually rise to the command of the army. There's some internal dispute that I've been trying to track about who exactly was the senior chela to Rajendragiri. In fact, I should also point out that I published this book 8 years ago. You can tell me whenever you want me to stop.
Keep going, keep going.
Because I realize I'm only on my first paragraph, but I've got, I don't know how much time we have. So anyway, I published this book 8 years ago, but once you start working on Anupgiri and Umraugiri, you can't stop. They're still alive in some ways, so I'm afraid to stop because I feel like they'll curse me. In any case, they are eventually maneuvered out of Awadh's service by the resident in Lucknow and by the company, who are increasingly influencing the politics of Awadh. And from 1775 to 1789, Anupgiri in particular is operating in and around the Delhi, what I call the Delhi-Agra axis. And he actually builds a headquarters in Vrindavan, and that's another thing I've been doing, is trying to track down some of the built space that remains from the Gosains. And one of them is a lovely palatial building, if anybody's been to Chirghat and in Vrindavan, and the Shahji Temple. Well, that Shahji Temple was the palace. The back of it was the palace of Anupgiri. And at this point, he and his brother Umraugiri had received the nom de guerre, the title from the Nawabs of Awadh, not sure which one, but of the title of Himmat Bahadur, which means, it's kind of a Persianate term meaning great, manifest courage, great bravery. In 1775 to 1789, they're operating in and around Agra and Delhi. They are very instrumental with Najaf Khan, the Persian adventurer. They actually assist Mahadji Scindia in interposing himself into Mughal affairs in North India. I should also say, and I'm jumping around a little bit, I apologize, in 1761 they're involved in the Battle of Panipat in the service of Awadh. In 1764 they're involved in the Battle of Buxar. So they're really involved in almost every major conflict in North India in the latter half of the 18th century. Eventually, Scindia gets fed up with Anupgiri and actually accuses him of trying to poison him through black magic. And Anupgiri then decides, with the patronage of the Peshwa, to ally himself to a Maratha warlord named Ali Bahadur, who's actually the illegitimate grandson of Peshwa Baji Rao, who had some offspring with the beautiful Mastani from Panna. Okay, and I don't know if any of you follow Bollywood news, but Mastani will soon be the subject of a feature film starring Priyanka Chopra, if we can believe what they say in the Bollywood reports. So she was a legendary beauty from Panna, and she had produced offspring, including Shamsher Bahadur, whose son then, Ali Bahadur, comes to North India as a warlord. And he allies with Anupgiri, and they enter Bundelkhand. So in a sense, Anupgiri comes full circle to Bundelkhand. So, and eventually becomes the Maharaja of Bundelkhand, and Ali Bahadur dies in 1802. In 1792, Anupgiri defeats the Rajput forces of Bundelkhand, the Bundela Rajputs, at the Battle of Ajaygarh. And he's really celebrated in poetry at this point in Braj Bhasha verse, written by Padmakar and Mankavi in particular. Padmakar was the last great Braj Bhasha poet. He's being celebrated as a great king, a yogi lord, etc., etc. In 1803, the British come calling. This is a period when the forces of the company are moving up the Gangetic Plain from Bengal, and the British, under the under the leadership of Richard Wellesley, the brother of Arthur Wellesley, and the Governor General, carve out an alliance with Anupgiri, which allows British company sepoys to enter the province of Bundelkhand, and together they essentially settle Bundelkhand. And Anupgiri actually dies the following year in 1804, and it's there's a lot of suspicion about how exactly he died. And eventually Gosain troops are demobilized. So that gives you a sense of his career. Now I want to reflect a little bit on who exactly was he. So to military commanders, and I'm going to read this bit. And again, William, tell me when you want me to stop.
No,
To military commanders assessing the military labor market of Hindustan in the early 19th century, Anupgiri and his men were Gusains, a term that connoted formidable military talent. Gusains, quote, were considered good troops on a par with Rohilla Afghans and Khalsa Sikhs, and just slightly less fearsome than Arab Sayyids. For Thomas Broughton, who encountered them in 1809 in the Maratha camp of Daulat Rao Scindia, Gusains had a reputation for being both powerful and faithful. In subsequent years, as they were being demobilized and gradually disarmed across North India, Anupgiri's men, and in fact Anupgiri himself posthumously, were described as Naga, or naked Gusains, referring specifically to their institutional connections to the military akharas of the Dasnami religious ascetic order descending, it is said, from the medieval sage Shankaracharya. This Dasnami institutional connection was also signified by the term Giri that adhered to their names, which is one of the 10 suffix terms that would make up the Dasnami or 10-named order. The Scottish surveyor Francis Buchanan, or Buchanan, however it's pronounced, would describe Giri Gusains in the early 19th century as, quote, rogues who with their naked bodies well rubbed with oil and holding a dagger pointed at both ends would force their way through a crowd, jabbing ferociously in all directions. So these are, interesting characters, right? He would also add that though the Naga akharas had been quite prevalent in Bihar and Bengal in earlier decades in what is remembered as the Sannyasi and Fakir rebellion, they had in recent years decamped from the province, that is of Bengal, and had gone to join the armies of the Rajas and chieftains beyond the Yamuna, that is, they'd gone to Bundelkhand and to Malwa, in other words, to join Anupgiri's forces. So at one level, Anupgiri was part of a well-known and, in the 18th century, expanding military culture that melded the institutions of religious asceticism to soldiering. This martial asceticism expanded, I think crucially, in the context of the expanding Mughal Empire, as well as during what the historian Muzaffar Alam would call its decentralization phase in the 18th century. As such, this warrior asceticism possessed distinct Mughal, Islamicate, Indo-Persianate connections. And it's in this context that Anupgiri had a more specific reputation. To the Nawabs of Awadh, he and his brother, of course, were known as Himmat Bahadur, as I've described. This title was received as a result of some feat of martial prowess that one of them or both of them had performed either at Delhi in 1753 or at the Battle of Panipat in 1761 or at the Battle of Buxar in 1764, where they famously ignored the oncoming fire of company forces and approached the sepoy lines armed only with sabers, or perhaps afterwards, when Anupgiri assisted in Shuja's escape from British pursuit. According to some accounts, Anupgiri himself received a grievous wound in his thigh, thus earning the title Himmat Bahadur from Shuja. Or possibly the title Himmat Bahadur stemmed from their fearless defense of Allahabad in 1751, as I've already described. However, as he became more influential, he had numerous detractors across North India. He became known as Jangi Raja, or as a troublemaker, in other words, as someone who foments war, or to use a term that we favor in American academics, a shit disturber. He's someone who provokes dissension so as to create a demand for his own intervention and service. Anupgiri was famous for controlling all the pieces on the political and military chessboard, even to the extent of deploying soldier spies in the enemy camp. Along these lines, Thomas Brooke, who was a judge in Benares, who loved to send frequent and unsolicited intelligence reports from Benares to the Governor General in Calcutta, Brooke wrote on the 3rd of June 1804 that, quote, Himmat Bahadur is not to be trusted. The natives speaking of him say he is like a man with his feet in two boats waiting to abandon the one that is sinking. Close quote. Ironically, of course, less than a year earlier, company forces had allied with Anupgiri, Himmat Bahadur, thus affording the British access to and eventual control of Bundelkhand, which ultimately protected their southern flank from Maratha attack and made the 1803 capture of Delhi possible. Others, especially around Vrindavan, where Anupgiri built a palace headquarters in the 1770s, called him a lutera, or a thief and a plunderer, not least for dismantling the Chhatri of Jawahar Singh, the Bharatpur Maharaja, to provide the building materials for his own sumptuous palace. Scindia would routinely refer to Anupgiri as faithless, as a scoundrel, especially as he developed a painful case of boils in the summer of 1788, which he attributed to Anupgiri's yoga-tantric occult hand. We begin to get a new and different kind of characterization of Anupgiri in the 1790s. After his conquest of Bundelkhand in alliance with Ali Bahadur, Anupgiri was celebrated as a great Maharaja and Yogi lord whose troops inspired terror in the hearts of the enemy with their chants of Har, 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 Har. Har is another name for Shiv or Shiva. Quote, this is a quote from Padmakar's verse, "The pounding of their kettle drums scattered the enemy like so many snorting pigs." This verse was written in the wake of Anupgiri's victory over Arjun Singh, the pride of the Bundela Rajputs near Ajaygarh in eastern Bundelkhand. According to the poet Padmakar, who is remembered as the last of the great Ritikal Kavis, the battle climaxed with Anupgiri on his trusty steed, assaulting Arjun Singh, who was mounted on an elephant, and decapitating him. Padmakar concluded the poem with Anupgiri then presenting Arjun's head to Parvati, the mountain goddess, and his body parts to a ravenous horde of ferociously hungry yoginis and baitalanis who raucously gorged themselves on Arjun's corpse. I also want to say here that one of the things I'm doing in the wake of finishing the Warrior Ascetics book is with two colleagues at Columbia University, Alison Bush, who may be here in the room somewhere, and Dalpat Raj Purohit. We're translating the Padmakar poem, Himmat Bahadur Virudavali, and the Mankavi poem, which is entitled Anupa Prakash, and we're translating it, and we're going to produce a sort of critical edition for use in classes and whatnot. So these are all characterizations of Anupgiri by others. How did Anupgiri describe himself? This is a more difficult question. Sadly, we get very little commentary in Anupgiri and Umraugiri's own voices. But his brother Umraugiri may have put it best when dealing with the recalcitrant resident to Lucknow, who was intent on maneuvering the Gosains out of the service of the Nawabs. He said, or he wrote, "I am not a mutasaddi, but a soldier." A mutasaddi is kind of like an official or a clerk or a bureaucrat. "I am not a mutasaddi, but a soldier. I owe to my sword everything I hold." This is an image of Gosain arms that conforms to the way Anupgiri is remembered near Banda, at the site of one of his samadhis. There are actually 3 different locations that compete for Anupgiri's samadhi, whereas he is still imagined and still venerated as Bhairav, a particularly fierce form of Shiva, as a cosmic kotwal or policeman. At one level, I would argue Anupgiri matters because he played a key role in the march of British arms up the Gangetic Plain, and thus aiding in what Sir Christopher Bailey so evocatively has described as the global, quote, imperial meridian for the British, catapulting the British to the status of a world power in Asia, even as their fortunes declined in the Americas. At a second level, Anupgiri matters because he prompts us to question our definition of asceticism and even our assumptions about religion, and to disrupt the Christian incrustations on asceticism that insist upon sexual celibacy, renunciation, and pietistic virtue. In short, in defining asceticism as normatively monastic. We're moved closer with Anupgiri to the original Greek definition of the ascetic from askesis, as discipline, training, self-knowledge, not for the worship of some external deity, but to afford the cultivation of interior transformation and supernormal power. There's a third reason that Anupgiri gains significance, and this has to do with how the political ascetic is reimagined in the late 19th century and ascetic or the national ascetic. In Padmakar's verse, written in the 1790s, as I've mentioned, Anupgiri is celebrated as a yogi lord who supports dharma, protects the poor, rewards Brahmins and poets, and of course destroys his enemies. Eventually that poem is published in 1910 in an edition that's edited by the Hindi literateur Bhagwan Deen. In this edited version, Bhagwan Deen actually vilifies Anupgiri as a traitor to his country. In fact, Bhagwan Deen laments that Padmakar didn't celebrate Anupgiri's vanquished opponent, the Rajput Arjun Singh. In order to understand how this happens, it's really necessary to situate Anupgiri in this longer history of the political imaginary of the ascetic. And the most important moment in that, I think, and I'll close with this sort of reflection, is the publication or the authorship and publication of an important novel that I'm sure most of you have come across and read about, called Anand Mat by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee in the late 19th century in 1882. Anand Mat Bankim was a Bengali writer. It's the first great Bengali novel. It's remembered as the novel of the Indian national movement. And in that novel, Bankim takes a historic event, which was the Sannyasi and Fakir rebellion in Bengal that I mentioned earlier, from the late 18th century, 100 years earlier. He takes that event and he reimagines it as a kind of Hindu ascetic patriotism ranged against foreign rule, particularly Muslim rule, Nawabi rule in Bengal, but also British rule to some degree, although there's some ambivalence in Bankim's novel about the status of the relationship between Bengalis and Indians and the British. But the point is that in this novel, the ascetic is suddenly being reimagined as a kind of sprung from the soil Hindu patriot. And that really is a very powerful idea that had been gathering steam during the course of the 19th century, and Bankim really taps into this notion of the political imaginary, the sort of what I would call the redemptive ascetic for the nation. This category, this figure of the national ascetic as a Hindu patriot, really informs a whole range of political actors in the 19th and 20th century, ranging from Sri Aurobindo to Swami Vivekanand, to, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, to Hedge, who founds the RSS in 1925, to Veer Savarkar, even to Godse, Gandhi's assassin, and even, I would argue, to the new Prime Minister Modi, who is, in fact, of course, the first sannyasi Prime Minister, and is, there's been a lot of, not as much discussion of this in the press. In fact, the mainstream press seems to ignore the fact that he really thinks of himself as a kind of sannyasi for the nation. So I think this idea of the national ascetic really informs that whole political discourse. But in that, the idea of someone like Anupgiri becomes really a true kind of anachronism, right? As someone who sells, as an ascetic an armed ascetic sells his services to the highest bidder, many of whom include, of course, Islamicate or Muslim Nawabs and emperors, the Mughal emperor, the Nawabs of Awadh, Najaf Khan, etc. And so he becomes a kind of anachronistic category mistake in the history of South Asia. And it's because of this, and also I think we could add to that, a kind of reimagining of the armed patriot ascetic, Hindu ascetic, as a nonviolent Hindu patriot or Hindu quasi-Indian patriot ascetic in the thinking of Gandhi, that even Anupgiri becomes, and the very idea of the armed ascetic becomes a kind of contradiction in terms, right? Because of that, it's very hard to actually find any remnants. In a way, Anupgiri and the built structures that he created sort of gradually disappear, and Umraugiri as well. They gradually disappear during the course of the late 19th and early 20th century. They show up obviously in documents and in poetry and in verse, and the built space still exists, but they really require, I think, a new attention because they help us see a much more fuller and interesting picture of the late early modern and modern period. And with that, I think I'll
first of all, is there any link at all? I mean, what you've described is so startlingly different to everything that most people think about yoga. Is there anything that Anupgiri did that would link him with the modern yoga movement? I mean, did he, any evidence he did asanas and he was sitting there doing his muchli asana in the morning? Or
No, I've not seen it. I mean, there, some of the images we have, and I think in a way, the work of David White actually helps to speak to this, because he really distinguishes very sharply between the idea of the yogi, which this idea of the sort of black magic, occult, dangerous figure who is the yogi, and the idea of yoga, which evolves over many twists and turns and becomes what we know of it today in the modern global context. But the images of Anupgiri really depict him more as a kind of yogi in the yogi context. So he has Shaiva for the most part, although Umraugiri has a mix of symbolic sectarian markings. Anupgiri is depicted as a kind of Shaiva yogi.
Like a modern Nagasadhu.
Like exactly. We would. Is this?
Yep.
Is this working? So we don't see him. We know very few images. There's only one image of him that I have. It's on the cover of the book.
We're going to come to that in a second.
Okay.
Your personal.
The images of armed Gosains and Nagas doesn't portray them doing any kind of asanas in the way that we would understand them. I mean, they're certainly in various kinds of martial poses, but not down dog or Surya Namaskar or anything like that. So no. That said, I think it's clear that for instance, texts like the Hatyo Pradipika provide a kind of sort of ideological context of you practice certain kinds of yoga. One of sort of not remarked much upon, except in David White's work, is that it affords a kind of immortality and personal defense from attack by other people's weapons. Right? But one other point I would just make. One of the things I focus on in the book is the idea of samadhi, and of course, when a Gosain dies, he's not cremated. He's actually buried in samadhi, ineffectively in a kind of padmasana position. So that would be but we don't have any images of that, of course, and we can't. In fact, I'm not even sure which samadhi of Anupgiri is the real samadhi.
There are two.
There are three, according to the records that I've. One's in Vrindavan, one's in a place called Shivrajpur, near Bitur, near Kanpur, and one is, of course, near Banda that I've already described. And, I suppose one could try and find the actual remains, if in fact he's really dead.
So, how far back does this tradition go? How early on do you find people undergoing certain exercises, training themselves, training their mind, in order to fight better?
Okay, well, it's very hard to say. David Lorenzen, who's a historian, retired now at the Colegio de Mexico, wrote a very nice piece about in 1978 called Warrior Ascetics and Indian History, where he essentially takes on this oral tradition. That is, he tries to argue against the oral tradition of armed asceticism, the origins of Hindu armed asceticism, which situates it as a kind of response to Muslim persecution in the medieval period.
And that, do you think, is a myth?
Yeah, it's clear that Lorenzen makes a pretty good case based on earlier records, including the Harsha Charita, that various kinds of swamis and yogis have been arming themselves from quite early on. And he argues that it's really to protect the monastic wealth of these groups from treasure-hungry kings, whether they're Buddhist or Muslim or Hindu or whatever. It has nothing to do with Muslim.
Tax dodge.
Right, in effect, right. So at that level, it's quite early, 6th, 7th, 8th century is where he locates it. I don't go back that far in my work. I'm more concerned. Marc Bloch, the famous French historian, wrote we should avoid, the search for the idol of origins. Or when you begin to search for origins, it's just turtles all the way down, right? You keep finding earlier and earlier evidence. And what's more interesting to me is the way this tradition really expands in the Mughal period, in the late Mughal period. It reaches a kind of apotheosis.
And it becomes very important in Rajasthan, particularly in Jaipur, doesn't it?
Jodhpur, absolutely, there are Nath yogis in Jodhpur who become very
just
important.
Talk a little about that. I mean, these guys took over the state of
right, in the late, let's see, it was in the early 19th century. I wrote about this a while ago, and I can't remember.
1820s.
Yeah, Man Singh of Jodhpur was essentially controlled by these Nath yogis connected to this worship of the sort of.
And these guys thought they could
Jalandhar
listen to conversations halfway across the globe. They could fly.
That was the understanding.
Yeah, and live forever.
Yeah,
We're invincible.
right. That's why I keep working on it, because if I don't, something bad might happen. What was the one other point about? Yeah, I mean, Lorenzen makes a good. He actually, in a way, he argues that because of there's an oral tradition that was collected in the early 1920s, actually, by a Scottish sort of missionary named J.N. Farquhar is how it's spelled. I think it's
Farquhar.
Farquhar, right. I was corrected in Edinburgh when I gave
Farquhar.
He's a Farquhar, right.
Yeah.
So Farquhar collects this oral tradition, actually at the Kumbh Mela, describing the arming of these sannyasis during the reign of Akbar. And the evidence is this oral tradition, and he relates it to a painting that's in the Akbarnama, and a description in the Akbarnama of Akbar witnessing a battle between two camps of yogis, actually a camp of sannyasis and a camp of yogis, and they're fighting over the
one
right.
One Vaishnav and one
Well, there have been
Shaivas.
various theories about who they are. Some people have argued, I think Giti Sen argues that they are Shaiva on the one hand and Vaishnav on the other. I think James Mallinson argues that they're all a bunch of Vaishnavs, of course. I've argued in the book that they were actually yogis and sannyasis, both one group becoming Dasnami sannyasis and one group being more of a Nath yogi tradition. It's very hard to know who exactly they are, but Akbar does give permission for them to fight each other. And over time, by the early 20th century, when of course North India is being swept up, not just North India, South Asia is being swept up in communal violence, or increasing communal sensibilities, Hindu versus Muslim, that moment seems to be reinterpreted as Akbar giving permission to the yogis and sannyasis to arm themselves against Muslims. And so it seems pretty obvious when you look at the evidence that, in fact, they were armed long before Akbar came on the scene.
Everything I read in your book implies to me that Himmat Bahadur is a very practical man. He's quite happy to ally with the Afghans and the Mughals against the Marathas.
Absolutely, right.
But is there any evidence that he actually believed himself to be immortal, to have magical powers, that he actually could give Scindia boils, as Scindia thought he'd done? I mean, our great chief minister who inaugurated our festival this morning, her direct ancestor believed that Himmat Bahadur had cast a whole plague of boils on his lower regions.
Yeah, it was in Mathura. I think Scindia was in Mathura. It was a case of the Mathura boils. I think it was described by Jadunath Sarkar in The Fall of the Mughal Empire as a case of the Mathura boils. Did he actually? Well, again, we have very little. I mean, as a historian, I have to go by what is in front of me in terms of documents. We have some. We certainly know how people thought about him.
And they were frightened of him.
And people were frightened. He was a terrifying figure, and he's, in a sense, a kind of Hairav on earth. And so
he's closer to one of these figures that you get in the oral tradition and in the epics of basically a sort of a kind of wizard. He was he's kind of wicked wizard.
Yeah, and of course that has leverage that for political uses, and it seems to be what he did. The closest we get, I think, perhaps to Anupgiri's self-understandings, perhaps, is the verse of Padmakar. But even there,
which says?
Padmakar, sorry?
Which says?
Well, that he's a yogi lord. He fights he employs the yogi's way of war, is this phrase in the poem.
Is there a yogi's way of war that's different? I mean, are they using
well, in the way it's actually described in the poem, what's happening is Anupgiri, it's rather odd because Padmakar describes the siege of Ajaygarh, right? And Ajaygarh is this fort. It's the sister fort of Kalinjar in eastern Bundelkhand. It's a lovely place to visit if you haven't been. It's near Khajuraho. It's a great day trip. And he's trying to explain, that is, Padmakar is trying to explain why it is that Arjun's forces, Arjun Singh's forces, the Bundela forces, decide to leave the protection of the fort. And the reason is that they're Rajputs, and Rajputs don't hide behind walls, right? They get out there and they fight and they kick ass, right? Or they carry home their shield, or they come home on it, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to cower behind walls. And so Anupgiri basically allows them to tire themselves out. He lets other people fight them for a while. He was very cunning. And eventually, once Arjun Singh is exhausted, Anupgiri steps in and decapitates him. That's the yogi's way of war. Take your time. Run away when necessary. Come back. You don't fight directly. You fight at the angle.
And use of intelligence and espionage too.
Absolutely. Yeah? He places his own men in the forces of his opponents. And of course, there's a long tradition of ascetics being used as spies, and I talk about some of this in the early chapters. In fact, the two earlier chapters in the book, Mughal yogis and warlords, are really an attempt to contextualize and situate Anupgiri, and Umraogiri, who are described in the third and fourth chapters, in a broader context of this warrior yogic asceticism.
Just before we open it to the floor, would you just tell very briefly the story of your discovery of the image of Anupgiri that sits on the cover?
Yes. So
I do no more than hold it up.
Yeah.
But,
so as I was nearing the completion of the research for the book, I wanted to get closer to the sort of voice of Anupgiri and Umraogiri, and so I thought, well, maybe I could try and find some of the built space that's associated with them. And there's a wonderful memoir of Mathura district written by Salmon Grouse, F.S. Grouse, in the 19th century. And in that, he describes a ghat in Vrindavan called Gusain Ghat, or sometimes called Himmat Bahadur Ghat. And he describes how it was built by Anupgiri Gusain. And Anupgiri used the materials from a sort of mausoleum for Jawahar Singh, who was the Bharatpur Maharaja, who had actually attacked Anupgiri, helped to ambush Anupgiri and Umraogiri some years earlier. So he actually dismantles this chhatri for Jawahar Singh and builds part of his fort and palace out of this. So I thought, well, I have to visit this place. I have to see, maybe the structure itself can tell me a little bit about what he was like as a person. Well, it's a sumptuous palace. It's sort of a late Mughal, mansion, basically, and a fort as well. And there's another one built by Umraogiri in Benares. Those of you who have walked by Manikarnika Ghat, Jalasan Ghat was Umraogiri Pushta. That was built by Umraogiri in the late 1700s. But anyway, so I go to this place in Vrindavan, and I'm looking around with my colleague and friend Kailash Jha, who's an old friend, and we're looking around and trying to find this ghat. Nobody seems to know where it is, and finally we meet what's his name? I'm blanking. But anyway, we find the ghat, it's Chir Ghat, where allegedly Krishna had stolen the clothing of the gopis. And we look around, and there's this big temple there, and it's actually called Himmatgiri Mandir. And so, well, that's clearly
good. Yeah.
right on the ghat, and it's part of the Shahji Mandir, which is a massive temple complex on the ghat. But it's a separate little mandir, sort of down by the water. And so image of Krishna is there. There's an image of Murti of Krishna, but right next to it is this image of this figure. And it immediately struck me because it's very similar to an image of Umraugiri held in Daraganj in Allahabad by the Mahanirvani Panchayati Akhada, which is a Dasnami Gusain Naga Akhada. And so I said, well, that has to be, there's no question, that has to be an image of Anupgiri. And eventually the Purohit came back from his lunch break, and we sat and talked to him for a while, and he in fact confirmed that this was in fact this Raja from Bundelkhand. He had all sorts of stories and about
and just to describe it, he's sitting, he's bearded, he's got his caste mark, and he's clutching a musket.
Clutching a musket, right? Yeah. So
there's an arm.
And he's got the hair, the matted hair wrapped around his head, which serves as a kind of helmet as well. So anyway,
guys, over to you. 5 minutes of questions. Front row. Oh, I think someone else is getting. Was it?
Yeah, hi. Fascinating character and story. Never heard of him before, so quite amazed. My question pertains to the Panipat battle. What really prompted this guy to fight against the Marathas? So sure, he was aligned with the Awadh Nawab, but was it just that? Was it just a mercenary thing? Was it geopolitics?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so the question is why did Anupgiri turn against the Marathas? He had these incredible Maratha connections, right? He had allied with Ali Bahadur in the 1780s. They had entered Bundelkhand together. Ali Bahadur was the grandson of the Peshwa, illegitimate grandson, but the grandson nonetheless. He was a Maratha. Anupgiri had assisted Scindia's intervention and introduction into North India in the 1780s. So clearly there was a lot of connections between the Gusains and the Marathas. It's a question that I ask in the book, and the only answer I have, well, there are two answers, I think. One is that Scindia had really turned against Anupgiri in 1789, threatened to kill him.
Because of the boils? Or?
Because of the boils, but also because of rivalries, and Scindia, from Anupgiri's perspective, wasn't sufficiently grateful to Anupgiri for having interposed him and injected him into Mughal politics in the north. And so Scindia had really become Anupgiri's enemy, in fact. And of course, the Peshwa had sort of bailed Anupgiri out by, effectively forcing Scindia to grant Anupgiri a kind of killat as a way of forgiveness. And then after that, then Anupgiri allies with Ali Bahadur and they go off. But, so part of it is a hostility to Scindia, okay? And as the Maratha forces in the late 1790s and early 1800s are amassing, hundreds of thousands of men are amassing in central India, getting ready to move north to cut off British lines as they're moving up the Gangetic North. Scindia is a very important part of that. Okay. Another big factor is that one of Anupgiri's main commanders is a man named John Mieselbach. He's a German-Dutch soldier of fortune who actually Ali Bahadur hires and then Anupgiri inherits to essentially modernize his forces.
So you have a Yogi army still naked but trained on sort of sepoy lines.
Absolutely, they're becoming more Sipahi-like, they're doing more infantry, they're using more artillery. So Mieselbach, who's remembered as Misl Baksh, is actually in charge of the Topkhana. There's a place in Banda that's associated with him in the downtown. And so Mieselbach really is important in this moment. Anupgiri, according to the records, according to Mieselbach, Anupgiri instructs him to make overtures to the British in 1803 in the summer. And Mieselbach, who has British connections because he'd come from Serampur near Calcutta, begins to contact some of his British contacts, John Amity and Richard Graham Mercer in particular, and they begin then to carve out this alliance. So that's a factor, Mieselbach's presence. But I think also a factor is that, in a way, and this I think, the work of Chris Bailey is actually really helpful, because the Gulsines represent a kind of corporate group, non-caste, right? Corporation in a way, and they resemble no more than anyone else. They resemble the East India Company in the way they operate. They're mobile. They have networks that are based, map onto pilgrimage networks. They have networks that cut across South Asia into Central Asia, whereas the British obviously are more networked on the oceans and increasingly penetrating inland. The Gulsines are networked on land. And in fact, you see in the 1750s, just before the Battle of Plassey, there's a Gulsine, I describe this in the book, a very prominent Gulsine, Nimmu Gulsine in Bengal, who offers his services to the East India Company forces. So there's a long tradition. And of course, Anupgiri had also been offering his services to the British in the 1770s and 80s. Just finally it came to fruition in the early 1800s. So, Chris,
one
over
last,
here.
and then we're going to wrap up, I'm afraid.
Is this on?
Yeah.
I guess my question for you is, they've obviously garnered a lot of power, a lot of political power with the various regimes, and you talked about the magic that they're believed to have. How does that magic kind of link up with yoga and their idea of being a yogi? Like in popular imagination, how does that link up?
Well, yogis have a sort of popular reputation of being black magic sorcerers. So I wouldn't link it up with yoga as such, although, again, in these medieval texts, yogic compendia like Hatha Yoga Pradipika and even Yoga Vashish to some degree, the performance of these asanas in different kinds of, Vajroli Mudra or what's the other one? Kechari Mudra, actually afford enormous power, immortality, ability to create, what's the term? Something like tremendous corporeal density, right? To shrink, to expand. So there is a connection between yoga, yogis, and magic. We tend to not notice it because of the other associations that have developed.
And this kind of 20th century reworking of yoga, is that an entire, when does that begin, the 1930s?
David White recently published a book on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra that describes some of this, and of course Mark Singleton has written about this quite eloquently. But yeah, it's really, I would say, a 19th and 20th century phenomenon where yoga sort of gets redefined as a kind of calisthenics for the nation.
Thank you very much. Please, a big hand for Vijay Finch. That's great. Such a great subject.
I would like to extend my gratitude to Mr. William and Mr. William for this wonderful session. I would like